Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to Gwen's Bookish Ramblings. Now 2 weeks late. Work is really kicking my butt of late, and I just have not been keeping up with things. So, that's why I missed last week entirely and am also late today. So, here we are, Elizabeth Peters, book number 8 of the Amelia Peabody series. And we return to Egypt once again. This time we are dragging Ramses in tow because there's only so long that they can leave Ramses with his aunt and uncle because, frankly, he's still a travail to deal with, though granted, less so. So this book, because this series is a very genuine, continuing through line series, a series with a lot of recurring characters. We bring back Kevin, the newspaper man. Again, he's kind of just a regular around here, and we love that because Kevin is fantastic. I mean, okay, he's, a bastion of yellow journalism, but that's fine. He's a hoot. We love Kevin. So we get a going over all of the stuff that happened, how she met her husband, how they found out about the quote-unquote master criminal, the thing about how the master criminal was shot, and all of this stuff. This is also done in an introduction because these books masquerade in a sort of layered reality thing. I think I've already mentioned this, but, just in case. These books masquerade as being the memoirs of a real person with introductions by her and by editors who do things like footnote her introduction. Sick, it says, ? As in SIC, that is that thing that you write when you say, I am quoting another person by saying this is not my misspelling, this is the misspelling of the original thing. So, for example, if I were quoting somebody who had written, instead of had written TEH, I could put a little sick next to that, open square bracket, SIC, close square bracket, to indicate that in the original copy, this was written as TEH, as opposed to this just being the error of the person who is, writing the thing. So we have this issue of, so the editor has, quote-unquote editor has written, sick. This is not consistent with other sources. However, the editors were of the opinion that it would be discourteous to question a lady's word. Then further footnotes saying, this bit of thing is from this book. Number 4, Mrs. Emerson refused to alter this statement despite the editor's objections to its prejudicial nature. Number 4, by the way, is, we had hoped to work at the Great Pyramid Field of Dashur that season, but the spite and jealousy of the then Director of Antiquities relegated us to the nearest site of Masguna. Yes, as I said, it's the editors objected. Number 6, Miss Emerson's reticence on this subject is difficult to understand since she has described these events in the 5th volume of her memoirs. And 8, for the details of these private personal matters, you refer to the snake, the crocodile, and the dog. Anyway, so we get this return to Egypt that opens with them at a ball because, the thing about the British during their colonial period is they tended to do their best to bring Britain with them, and that meant that you would have wholly British cotillions and events and everything in Egypt. One does not adapt to local Egyptian culture. One drags English culture with one everywhere. And so they are discussing, and so that you open with this, and Emerson is trying to be romantic. He has bothered to learn how to waltz because, well, while Emerson is of such a class that he probably learned a bunch of dances, waltzing has always been something of a much more romantic dance, and one that requires a great deal of effort to learn to do properly, and he seems like the kind of person who would have been thoroughly uninterested in it when a teenager, and by the time he was old enough that it might have in any way interested in him, he would have been, had absolutely, no interest in lowering himself, but now that he has a wife who is interested in things like going to balls, he has finally lowered himself to learning how to waltz. So this opens with Emerson surprising Amelia by taking her waltzing. So what you have here, however, is that we start with the ball, but then we have a flashback to earlier, and the flashback is the fact that Amelia's very good friend, Emerson's sister-in-law, because she married his brother, Walter, they've had several children, but their most recent child was lost in childbirth. And naturally, not remotely unexpectedly, both of them, Walter and Evelyn, are not doing well following the death of a child, because, shockingly, parents who love their children deeply are not going to take it well when they lose one of them, even if it is a newborn baby. So, both of them are having trouble. Evelyn, in particular, is kind of... It's that old trope, and, one hesitates to use trope because, of course, this is one of those things that springs from reality, but it's that old shtick of a woman who has suffered this loss and is basically taking it out on her husband. Not, like, viciously or, through active cruelty, but just she's being distant, she's being difficult, she is treating him unkindly. Like I said, she's not being abusive or anything in any way, she's just being difficult, being mildly insulting, and putting him off, and they're both just trying, and Walter is desperately trying to be there for his wife, but it's hard because she's making it hard. It's that classic thing where somebody is trying to help another person and they can't because that other person is making themselves impossible to help. So the idea is floated and agreed upon to bring Walter and Evelyn to Egypt with them. That was where they all first met, was when Walter was working with his brother in excavations, because Walter is an expert in hieroglyphics, and so, he is a tremendous help to Emerson in terms of understanding what they're looking at when he sees, hieroglyphic writing on a wall or what have you. So they bring them with, they bring Walter and Evelyn with them back to Egypt, and Evelyn spends a lot of this book sort of being difficult, being, unhappy with Walter, acting like, any of his solicitude is just, too much interference for her to bear. And it's that sort of difficulty that you have going around. And interestingly enough, they finally reach a point which they both have a blow-up late in the book, Evelyn and Walter do, and that blow-up is very amusing in that, it's two married people who have been carefully and judiciously not shouting at each other, and not shouting at each other, and not shouting at each other, until they finally snap and start shouting at each other, and it gets to the point where Amelia actually winds up saying, declaring in the memoir that this was probably the best thing they could have done for their relationship, that they were finally having this out. And she's like, but not in front of people. So she, reluctantly, because it's sort of that thing where, she's looking at this couple and she's like, God, finally, they are talking about this and discussing their problems. But guys, please don't do this when you are surrounded by everybody else interestedly watching you. And, she has to sort of reel them in because they're having this argument. So it's an interesting little moment because, you can sort of understand that issue, that point of, you guys really, really need to talk about this. It's great that you're finally talking about it, but not now. Kind of like all those times in the movies when people are dangling upside down off a cliff and finally are having that argument that they should have had 8 scenes ago. It was not quite that. It was more, you're having that argument you should have had 8 scenes ago with everybody watching, and maybe you need to go somewhere else to have this argument. Anyways, it all works out in the end. This is slightly less, a smidgen less of a shark jump than the book that gave us Nefret, but there's a lot of shenanigans in this one. This is a book full of shenaniganry. They wind up adopting another kid. His name is David, and David is the child. Now, Abdullah is like their foreman who, he's local Egyptian man. He's getting on in years. He's a grandfather. But he is Emerson's right-hand man. And so David is his grandson, but is David and not Daoud because his father was like a Christian missionary and his mother ran off with the Christian missionary and they both died. And so David was left without parents and wound up sort of falling in with a guy who makes forgeries. It's a whole thing. So they've effectively kind of taken on another kid, another ward. David and Ramses have declared themselves blood brothers, which Amelia sort of had one of those moments because Ramses does this kind of thing. Yes, okay, I'm just going to slice my hand open and put it to the sliced open hand of another boy, and we're going to say, yes, we're blood brothers now, because we've known each other for 10 minutes. And Ramses is like that. He's still like that. He's like 12 or 13 years old in this book, and he's still like that. He is learning to reel it in, however. His mother is not having to tell him to please be quiet, Ramses, nearly as much as when he was, 8 years old and with a tendency to just speak everything to the point that people would happily ignore clues he had because at least he would stop talking. So there's something, but Ramses gets himself into trouble and is gotten out of trouble, and Nefret gets herself into trouble and manages to get herself out of trouble, and, there's a local mob boss, and it's a whole thing. And then at the very end of it, it turns out that there was a mastermind who was basically the master criminal who had been behind so many of these books, who had been madly in love with Amelia, and really weird about it, that he's dead, but this woman decided to effectively tell his whole network, he's still alive and I am speaking on his behalf. And she was good enough at that they believed her and kind of moved in to take over his, his criminal empire. And then when Amelia confronts her about it at the end of the book, more or less just because Amelia kind of wanted to wrap up loose ends, she actually tries to tell Amelia, well, aren't you impressed that I'm getting my feminist career going? And Amelia's just like, you're a criminal. No. Anyways, yeah, so that's that's everything, and I will hopefully not have my butt kicked by work again, and see you all next week.